Bungalow Bill here, and welcome back to From the Depths. I've survived the wedding that I went to recently, and I'm really ready to get back into the adventure mode. But before that, I've been working on some weapon systems for the adventure mode, one of which is small gauge APS, which is the one we'll be focusing on here. The other one is the most firepower efficient per cost weapon system that I'm aware of, at least not involving melee, because I do not know the firepower calculations for them particularly well. So here we just have a few shell components first. And really, the reason that I want to look at them is that I haven't looked extensively into a lot of the APS calculations. I will still not be looking fully in depth into them, merely at a portion of them, which will help to inform some of my decisions. However, still does miss pieces that are necessary for actually optimizing systems. So here, let's take a single module of 500mm high explosive. It has a reload time of 52.5 seconds. If I take two modules, well, that's not double the reload time, actually. It's 70 seconds. And, well, this is, if I was to keep adding more, you would see that it grows linearly, but it's not directly proportional. If I was to extrapolate this down to 0 modules, I would get a base reload time of 35 seconds. And then for each meter of autoloader that I add on top of that, I'm looking at an additional 35 seconds on the reload speed. And this is primarily what this episode is going to be about. There is an additional complication. Let's do the same thing for gunpowder. Barrel cooldown, 41 seconds. Barrel cooldown, 32 seconds. So what that means is that if I make the shell longer, I just maybe by doubling the number of components in it, I don't need twice the barrel coolers, or twice the gauge coolers, rather. So there will be some additional efficiency gained there that I do not look at. I don't look at the cooling components of this at all. I only look at reload calculations, and I only look at reload calculations in terms of payload components that are full length. Casing components are a quarter the normal length, so these will change the calculations. What I'm looking at here is incredibly simplified. So do not expect to be able to make optimized choices on it. It's just me beginning to understand some of the concepts here a little bit better. With that out of the way, we're going to move on to spreadsheets before we do the live fire testing. Okay, what we have here is a spreadsheet, and it's not terribly well labeled. Here we have a comparison, or really this is just a chart or some sort of table. We have gauge up here and length of the shell here. And then due to the 20 module limit, there is a series of disallowable values here because these are the reload times in seconds for an autoloader carrying a shell of this length and gauge. Which is, you can kind of see here that between 10 modules and 20 modules, well, 20 modules is really basically just double 10 modules. The penalty that you're paying is fairly low. There's a table over here that we'll go to in a second that gives the penalty, or the relative penalties. And then if you're looking at 500 millimeters, well, this is the difference between 2 and 4 components. This kind of hurts, right? This isn't 140, it's 105. There's a really big percentage difference there. And we can go over this to this table and we can look. So this is the kind of, it's basically the efficiency of a reload in terms of modules compared to a full-length shell. And okay, so it's not necessarily terribly useful without knowing how much it costs you to have a shell that long. And I would look at this as more of the penalty for, it's more useful as the penalty for underfilling an autoloader than it is, oh, and this doesn't apply to belt feds either. They have their own formula that I've never looked at before because I don't use them. So this is really just the penalty for underloading an autoloader, but if you use the costs of autoloaders as well, you can get a useful formula out of this. But this shows that a single module shell, you're basically running the gun at half efficiency. The overhead of just the base reload time for the shell is really as much as the additional reload time for the number of modules. Well, actually, it is exactly, because these efficiencies cap a 20. They're as a ratio for a full shell, which is why there's a little bit here, which is sort of like the performance penalty for a full shell. You can sort of look at how you want, but when you look at these reload times for these different shell lengths, they correspond to ratios between values in this table. This is really sort of all-encompassing. This table is clip costs. So 1 meter no clip, including ammo intakes. So I only use values from this table. And I only use values from this table because the gun that we're showing has 3 clip Tetris. These other ones are there in case I feel like looking at other Tetrises in the future to see how it changes things. Something to note is that you pay a lot more for the second meter. Well, so first off, you pay a lot more for the first meter than for any other meter. Then you pay more for the second meter than for any of these other following meters, and then it's flat after that. Now, these formulas... Okay, so these formulas are multiplied by 1,000 just to make them more easy to compare to each other. But they're basically meters of shell that you can throw downrange per minute. And all of this stuff is assuming your shell is entirely shell modules. These are basically full HE poles. So this is really only particularly useful for a pure railgun. You can basically just compare anything in this column, and wherever the value is the highest is where you get the highest efficiency. So this means if I was making a 500mm pure HE railgun, well, I'd pick 2 meters, but I don't have a huge falloff against 3 meters. 3 meters is fine. And then I start to pay more of a price. Similarly, at 333 meters, here 2 meters is really looking quite a bit stronger. And anywhere under that, I'm going to use 1 meter. Okay, so even for the test guns that I built for this platform, which use 125mm shells, this falls apart a little bit because of the aforementioned gunpowder scaling. I actually get a better cost efficiency, but a poorer volume efficiency out of 2 meter autoloaders. You're almost always going to get a better volume efficiency out of 1 meter autoloaders. It's going to be a little more challenging once you really start pushing it down this far. But for reasonable shell lengths, you'll always get a better volume efficiency for 1 meter autoloaders. And then for reasonably large... Okay, not even for reasonably large amounts, but even for moderate amounts of gunpowder, you're usually going to start seeing better cost efficiencies as you go down in the autoloader length. I do need to do this comparison. This is where it's going to really get interesting. For different amounts of gunpowder, which would take the coolers into account and that sort of thing. Because this might push it a little bit further down. And then once you start getting into railguns, it gets even more complicated, and it's going to push it even further down to the point where you really only start to get great damage efficiency way down here in the table. And not even just for railguns, but for any kinetic guns. The purer a railgun is, the less gunpowder casings it has. It might actually push this back up the table. But Don't know. That's really just all speculation. This really is just the absolute simplest possible comparison. Well, let's jump back into From the Depths, look at the actual guns, what ammo types I'm loading them with, and what I could potentially be using them for. Okay. Here I have a weapons test platform for a variety of uses. I do have a few shells that I just remembered that I'm going to have to tweak before the testing. It's because these 125 millimeter shells have a fuse in them. Actually, everything here is at 125 millimeters and has a fuse, and it causes the shell to be just a hair shorter than it should be. So I'm going to put in an extra component to fill the shell all the way up, as is explained in the first part of the video. So anyway, these are all the same Tetris. They're a 3-clip Tetris. It's possible you can do it more efficiently than in a 9x9 turret than I did. This is just what I came up with. That fully fills the space except for columns here and a column here. There's stuff that you can do with that space. These are particularly interesting because they have no recoil dampening, which is actually why there's so much space. This needs to be recoil dampened fully. This needs 20 meters of recoil dampening, which would basically fill all of the remaining space that I have. So there is a reasonable chance, because I have that space, I'm going to recoil damp it. This turret costs 35,000, produces 60 firepower. It'll be a hair more than 59.48 when I finish filling up the shell. Don't know exactly by how much. And the thing to notice about this is that when it is firing, it only gains 0.04 degrees of inaccuracy, because the inaccuracy the max inaccuracy you can get seems to be dependent on the recoil of an individual shell. Because this fires very small shells, that value is fairly low. And so if I look, okay, so it needs about 20 meters of recoil absorber at 80 resources per meter. That's 1,600. 1,600 resources. That's noticeable, but not terrible. Particularly for CWIS applications, I will probably put those recoil absorbers in. With a slow shell, it's really only valid in timed fuse applications. There's also the downside here that because these shells do not have many components to begin with, putting multiple fuses in them can be quite costly. So just as a ratio, the amount of fuse in them becomes quite high. The differences between all of these Tetrises is whether or not they're ammo ejected. This is actually just here in a size and firepower comparison, as well as cost comparison, because it's at 500 gauge. It also needs recoil absorbers. The other ones can get away without it, but this one actually needs it. And it still only gets, even with the longer barrel, gets to the same inaccuracy as these have with no recoil absorption. These are also here to show how, even at 50 millimeters, the inaccuracy I get is pretty bad with no recoil absorption. You really can't get away from it with railguns. You can, to some extent, with non-rail APS. If I didn't rail boost these, I can just kind of barely get away with it. These have tracers, so the inaccuracy only actually goes up to 1 degree. That can be pretty manageable. Pretty manageable if you're not rail boosting it. I have some ships that have no recoil absorption, non-rail boosted kinetic weapons, and it's okay. But for the other ones, this is ammo ejector Hesh. And then the rest of these are basically just timed fuse HE and no ammo ejection, because I can really only get away with one fuse. That doesn't mean that these turrets will pop. If a turret's small enough, I don't care that much. And it actually has a little bit of empty space of its own where I could put a few recoil absorbers. Not enough to fully dampen it, but a few. It's because it uses the same Tetris, but it doesn't have so it uses more of the vertical space, and it doesn't have the ammo ejectors in it, so it gains even more empty space in it. Alright, this one's not the timed fuse variant. This is the full HE variant to show the firepower difference that I get from taking fuses out. Again, it'll close a little bit once I fill up the shell, but I'm only not using 25 millimeters of shell, so it's not going to be a huge difference. This is the timed fuse one, which is why it has the all-in-one CWIS controller. And this is the 2-meter variant. Because the fusing is a smaller percentage of the shell, and because despite using the same percentage of gunpowder casings and firing a larger total number of shell components, this requires fewer coolers for the same effect. So about 20 fewer coolers. Okay, so this one could lose a few. Whereas this one's, and they could both lose a few, but roughly 20 fewer coolers at 50 each. Not a huge difference, 1,000 materials, but it does become noticeable. And this one actually does perform in addition with the fuses into account, is actually slightly more firepower per cost efficient, but is noticeably larger, being a 2-meter taller turret. Alright, I'm going to strip this down until I have just one type of turret on at a time, and do a few live fire tests with them. Okay, so now I have 6 of these smaller unejected turrets that produce 60 firepower each or so, for a total of 357, and they cost 35k a piece, so that's a total of 210k, which means this is about the total armament, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little more depending on the ship, that I'd put on, no, definitely a little bit less for most of my ships, that I'd put on a ship the same cost as the Rhea. So we'll just spawn the Rhea in, shoot at my favorite block of armor, just peppering it with a bunch of little shots. And this is Hesh, so the idea is get that damage into turret caps, and the Rhea's APS firepower has seen better days. We are popping CWIS turrets, we're racking up damage nicely. This is 125 millimeters, which is about the smallest gauge. You can maybe go a little smaller than this to actually get the HE damage from the Hesh. It might not be worth it to some extent. This has about a 60-meter detection range from lambs. You can push this down to, I think it's around 30 by dropping to 50-millimeter gauge, which 50-millimeter gauge is still moderately successful at doing actual Hesh things. So if you want to pass through something like the Meg with a small craft, or not lose too much firepower through to her lambs, pushing the gauge down a little bit would be pretty viable, and is what I'm probably going to do for my Hesh formulations of this. We'll lose a little bit of power. I didn't do any of the actual math for the firepower calculations, but things that use basically chemical shells are supposed to scale a little bit better at higher gauge. In particular, getting up to like the 125 to 150 millimeter mark seems to make a really big difference. The other thing that makes this test even more conclusive for dearming the Rhea really quickly is putting all of these guns in separate AIs. I didn't do it here, but I've done it before. It sweeps the deck of the Rhea really quickly. So the other thing is, if I retarget really slowly, and it's not as easy to see here because I'm using Hesh instead of frag or HE, it can still bore through the interior of a craft with a moderate speed for the amount of firepower that it has. It's not going to drill holes straight through that quickly, especially under the waterline when it's bouncing a lot of shells. But it can pierce through to relatively well-armored portions. But depending on how long you're actually willing to concentrate fire for, you may or may not waste a fair amount of fire. If, the AI just targets the wrong place for a while, but that's sort of the same risk you take when you shoot really large shells, too. Alright, so the Rhea's basically got nothing going on anymore. But really, in particular, it's the threat to turret caps, unarmored APS, stuff with no spall liner, a lot of the detection systems, sometimes drive shafts for propulsion. That's really the valuable thing here. And in particular, a lot of what I'm thinking on mounting it, this kind of weapon too will have plunging fire. So not a lot of decks on anything but the large ships will have air gaps in them. So small gauge, just peppering a ship with small gauge HESH with plunging fire, very, very valuable most of the time. Alright, so I have basically one other version of this turret that I was fairly interested in. So bring that out as well. Alright, here's the issue that I needed to fix. Either boost the velocity up by a little bit, or the issue here basically being that you can't reduce HE amount. So ultimately making the shell a hair longer. We'll reload a little bit slower, in exchange get a slightly higher muzzle velocity for it. Whether or not that's worth it depends on how much you value muzzle velocity. I, of course, could replace one of those gunpowder casings with another HE casing. Make it even slower. 6 shell, 3 casing, that's what I'm looking for. So I, for some reason, didn't save the actual turret that I wanted. So we'll just very briefly go over it, I guess. Alright, so I threw together a very rudimentary targeting set. Basically just spreads its fire among projectiles, prioritizes closer ones, prioritizes larger ones, ignores things outside of a certain angle of incidence. Not necessarily the best thing, but I threw that together in about 30 seconds, so what do you really want? This slightly lower firepower now, well, really noticeably lower at 56.88, largely due to the fuse in it. However, still only costs about 35k. So you could throw, you could have around 1.5 of these on something the size of the Banshee, against something the size of the Banshee, and we could get a little bit more accuracy out of this. So one of the things that it really does need is to deprioritize things that get too close so that it doesn't do what it just did, but it's actually still moderately successful. But with this amount of accuracy and timed HE, it's able to hit things. It's not exactly the best, but it still is functional. So with slightly better targeting, hopefully slightly better detection if I can get the missiles from further away a little bit, there could be something here, especially because it probably won't be firing at the smallest missiles. And then I can have the LAM system, or, the LAMs, there's That's the whole ATM machine thing. Okay, forget it. But pick up the smaller ones. Just pick up the larger ones like this. Should mitigate a lot of damage from missile craft that don't have a lot of solid bodies on them, while still doing fairly good work to enemy vehicles, because we're just slowly chipping away at the Banshee. This isn't incredible damage, but I mean it's fine. We're getting there, and if we're able to severely mitigate the Banshee's firepower in the process, well, we'll eventually kill her. And of course, once she takes a little bit of damage, it's way easier to deal with her incoming fire. And even by now, yeah, Banshee's despawning. So obviously we're in God mode, but this sort of thing with a proper ability to spot missiles, or basically against anything other than small missiles that we can't properly detect, should at least be able to mitigate their damage to some extent. A lot of people prefer kinetic Sea-Wiz. For larger missiles, I do think it struggles. It can struggle a little bit sometimes, but is also potentially a viable thing I could do here. I do have it on some other crafts as well. Well, anyway, that's all the fiddling for today. I do have, as mentioned before, I do have one additional weapon that I have been testing, but I'm not going to put it in this video. I'm going to wait until later. So, as always, I hope you've enjoyed watching, and I hope to see you in the future.